among regional powers. Let's first bring in Arirang's Devin Whiting for the latest news updates. Devin?
Hi, Dawn. South Korean President Moon Jae-in is urging his government to focus on reviving the country's manufacturing industry. At a cabinet meeting Tuesday, he said it's a relief that some key economic data, including unemployment, have shown improvements recently. But he admitted that manufacturing is still a big problem. Here's the president.
세계 경제의 둔화로 세계 제조업 경기 전반이 어려워진 영향도 있으나 그렇다고 외부 탓으로만 돌릴 일이 아닙니다. 우리 제조업의 경쟁력이 낮아지고 있는 것이 문제입니다.
The president also called for eco-friendly vehicles, including electric and hydrogen cars, to be put on the roads faster. And he highlighted the importance of new industries like bio, health, and 5G. Officials at the meeting were also briefed on the results of President Moon's three-nation tour of Southeast Asia. He emphasized the need for joint efforts with countries in the ASEAN bloc for an era of co-prosperity. Meanwhile, the cabinet approved spending to boost job creation and innovation-led growth. The government will lower the bar for companies to get tax credits when they bring stay-at-home moms back into the workforce. North Korea and the U.S. disagree about why their latest summit broke down, but America's top diplomat Mike Pompeo is stressing again that what both sides want is a better future for North Korea. What they need to settle on is the sequence of how that plays out. Lee Seung-jae reports.
In an interview with KCMO, a radio station based in his home state of Kansas, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Pyongyang and Washington are trying to get the, quote, sequencing right in talks to end the North's nuclear weapons program, while at the same time opening a brighter future for the country. His remarks on Monday came in the wake of North Korea's threat to walk away from the talks, as the regime called for a step-by-step dismantlement of its nuclear program in exchange for U.S. concessions, including sanctions relief. When asked about the failure to produce an agreement at last month's North Korea-U.S. summit in Hanoi, Pompeo said he couldn't say much about the details of the negotiations, as they were important private conversations, but did say it had to do with a range of issues around the timing and sequencing of how denuclearization is to be achieved. Pompeo, however, remained optimistic over the prospect of achieving the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, despite the recent setback in Vietnam. He said conversations will certainly continue, noting it was North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's promise to the world at his first summit with President Trump in Singapore that the North will indeed abandon its nuclear weapons program. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, South Korea says the reason the Hanoi summit fell apart is that the two sides had different expectations. Namely, the U.S. wanted to look at the entire road ahead, while the North was focused more on steps to be taken more immediately. Lee Ji-won explains.
South Korea's foreign ministry has pointed to the different ranges of denuclearization North Korea and the U.S. brought to the table as the reason for the collapse of the Hanoi summit last month. During a meeting on Monday of Parliament's Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, Minister Kang said the U.S. wanted to draw a big picture of denuclearization and its corresponding measures, but that the North was only prepared to discuss its Yongbyon nuclear facility. The ministry later added that Washington focused on defining denuclearization, freezing weapons of mass destruction and missile programs, and developing an overall roadmap, while the North focused only on the denuclearization steps that can be taken at the moment. On sanctions alleviation, Kang said the North will need to take bolder steps towards dismantling its nuclear program. To a lawmaker's question on whether the U.S. doesn't consider sanctions alleviation as part of its corresponding measures, Minister Kang said she does not think that's the case, hinting at the possibility of a partial lift depending on the North's moves. In solving the current tug-of-war, the minister said South Korea must open all possibilities, including sending a special envoy to the North and possibly having another inter-Korean summit. On the latest activities at the Dongchanglim missile site, Seoul's Unification Minister Cho Myung-gyun said there is a possibility that such restoration activity could have been to show the actual blowing up of the site if the two sides had reached a deal in Hanoi. But with activities continuing there even after the summit, Cho said there is a need to continue watching and analyzing the North's intentions. When asked if the North is willing to give up its nuclear weapons, Minister Cho said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is focused on developing its economy and that it's thought Kim would need to denuclearize his regime to achieve that and obtain a security guarantee. 이지원, Arirang News.
South Korea is looking to hold more reunions for families separated by the Korean War, this time by video conference. And they might not be just for people living here on the peninsula, but for Korean Americans too. Seoul's Unification Ministry told reporters Tuesday that it's preparing to talk with North Korea about including Korean American families in the video reunions so they can reconnect with their long-lost relatives in the North. Those discussions with the North haven't happened yet, but in a recent working group meeting with the U.S., South Korea received all the sanctions waivers it needs to make it happen. In the meantime, Seoul is reviewing how much money would be needed for the reunions in terms of renovations and other purchases. Yesterday, we reported about how fine dust pollution has cost the country big time economically. Today, we have a new study that says fine dust in Korea is affecting the health of pregnant women and their babies. Oh Soo-young has more.
Pregnant women living in dust-filled areas have an increased risk of going into early labour. Researchers from Kyung University Hospital and the National Cancer Centre analysed the births of 1.7 million newborns from 2010 to 2013. They found mothers within the first 37 weeks of pregnancy who lived in dusty areas of Korea were 1.5 times more likely to give birth prematurely. Women in their first 32 weeks of pregnancy were twice as likely to go into early labour. Those residing in areas where the average fine dust density exceeds 70 micrograms per cubic metre had a 7.4% chance of giving birth before their baby's due date. On the other hand, women living in less polluted areas had a 4.7% chance of going into premature labour. Researchers say there's a clear correlation between fine dust levels and premature births, stressing the need for further studies. On Monday, Health Minister Bang Neung-woo said at a parliamentary session that some $2.8 million will be allotted to research on how exposure to fine dust impacts human health. Studies will focus on socially vulnerable people, including infants, the elderly, pregnant women, and chronically ill patients. Joining hands with public and private institutions, the 5-year research initiative will aim to identify channels of exposure and how to reduce their impact. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Also, to help reduce fine dust, much of which comes from power plants, South Korea is going to drastically lower the import duty on liquefied natural gas, or LNG, a cleaner type of fuel. That'll start next month. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy said Tuesday that the current duty on LNG of 20 U.S. cents per kilogram will be reduced to around 3 cents, down around 84%. On the other hand, the duty on coal will be raised from the current 30 cents to around 40 cents. The government estimates the move will reduce fine dust emissions by around 400 tons a year. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Back to the issue of the stalled North Korea-U.S. nuclear talks. Seoul is stepping up efforts to play the mediator between Pyongyang and Washington. Seoul's top nuclear envoy is now in Russia as part of efforts to earn support from other countries and keep the stalled nuclear talks moving forward. North Korea, meanwhile, appears to be shoring up ties with its own allies after the collapse of the Hanoi summit. Here's our Lee Ji-won for more, and we'll be back with an expert to talk further on post-Hanoi developments among the regional powers.
Seoul Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs Do-hoon is set to meet with Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Igor Morgulov in St. Petersburg Tuesday morning local time, where they will discuss the results of the Hanoi summit. Similar to his sit-downs with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts in the past weeks, the visit is seen as part of Seoul's efforts to discuss the next steps for North Korea-U.S. negotiations, as well as seek cooperation from the international community. After his 2-day trip to Russia, the nuclear envoy will head to Brussels, where he will attend a session of the EU's Political and Security Committee and have a sit-down with Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Helga Schmid. Yi's trip to Russia comes amid frequent exchanges between Pyongyang and Moscow in recent weeks, especially since the Hanoi summit collapsed. The North state-run Korea Central News Agency reported last week that the two sides agreed to actively promote coordination on economic, cultural, and humanitarian fronts during North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Im Chun-il's visit to Russia last week. According to Bloomberg, this includes exchanging prisoners. Together with his Russian counterpart Igor Morgulov, Im also committed to plans for exchanges in 2019 and 2020. The two sides are also holding discussions in Pyongyang, where Russia's former ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, arrived on Saturday. On his arrival to North Korea, Kislyak reportedly said the purpose of the visit is to continue talks with Russia's ally and to get a deeper understanding of North Korea's ambitions. While the message is not yet clear, many observers say the latest diplomatic exchanges could hint at North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's possible visit to Russia or the North's hopes of having Russia get more involved in lifting the economic sanctions off the regime. 이지원, Arirang News.
And now Dr. Ko Myung-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies joins us in the studio for an in-depth discussion on regional diplomacy after the Hanoi summit. Thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
We're hearing a lot about increased contact between North Korea and Russia, and high-profile Russian delegation is now reportedly in Pyongyang for talks. How do you see the increased contact between the two sides?
I think the recent visits by Russia to North Korea have been pre-scheduled. We know that North Korea has been postponing or putting off major meetings with, such as meeting with the President Putin of Russia, actually also coming to Seoul as a return visit to meet with the President Moon in South Korea for after the second summit with President Donald Trump. And I think Russia has been thinking about the further expanding dialogue and exchange with North Korea, having seen that there's been some progress being made on the denuclearization negotiation front between North Korea and the United States. So I think that's the reason why they are there. But now the purpose is clearly different. Now probably they want to find out more about what really happened in Hanoi and probably trying to mount a response that could really bring stability to the peninsula.
So the contacts were pre-scheduled, but they were just delaying it until after the Hanoi summit. China has been somewhat cautious in taking sides, especially amid the ongoing trade conflict with the U.S. But there's no doubt that North Korea's nuclear issue is at the top of China's diplomatic agenda. How do you assess China's current stance or strategy with regards to North Korea's nuclear issue after the Hanoi summit?
Well, Chinese interests in the Korean Peninsula are actually quite transparent. They want stability in the Korean Peninsula above anything else. And probably from the Chinese perspective, what took place in Hanoi probably wasn't to their liking. I mean, clearly they see that there's a drifting between North Korea and the United States after the Hanoi summit, and there's actually an increase in little bit of increase in tension, not in the actual action, but in terms of argument between the two sides. So I think it's in the interest of the Chinese to intervene, but in a subtle way, to somehow bring the two sides together again, and then also start the negotiation again about denuclearization.
So China, for the time being, doesn't want to be too outspoken. Now, talks between North Korea and the U.S. appear to be turning sour, at least for the time being. Can we say that China card has become more useful now to North Korea than before amid the Pyongyang-Washington rift?
Well, clearly for North Korea, they need all the help they can count. And then for the North Koreans, the optic is pretty good. If the Chinese somehow make a very strong statement supporting the North Korean position regarding the negotiation that could be happening with Washington down the road, I think that's going to give a lot of energy to North Korea. And that's the problem, though. I mean, I think the Chinese are not so clear about what it's not clear for them somehow to discern what really happened in Hanoi and trying to fix if there's any problem between the two sides, meaning North Korea and the United States. But I think for North Korea, seeing that China as a traditional ally, would like the perception that China is backing them up in their position regarding the United States.
Do you think the ongoing trade conflict with the U.S. is making China harder to intervene with regards to North Korea's nuclear issue?
Well, clearly there's that element. I mean, the trade spat between the two major powers like China and the United States are really essentially distracting China, so to speak, from North Korea. Or you can put it the other way. China doesn't want to get distracted because of the North Korean problem at the moment. But then we know that the discussion between United States and China regarding trade is going to wrap up in a couple of months. We know, right now China and the United States are discussing about the upcoming visit by President Xi to the United States. And the expectation is that that visit is going to be, like Hanoi summit, a coda to this long dispute between the two countries regarding trade. So after China settles the trade issue, I think that China can raise its voice when it comes to the situation in the Korean Peninsula.
Now, reports are trickling in about Chinese President Xi Jinping's possible visit to North Korea next month. What are the chances of the two leaders meeting for talks?
Again, if President Xi goes to Pyongyang next month, that'll be actually could be seen as a too strong like a way to show support for the North Koreans. So I think there's some talks that President Xi might visit South Korea in June. So chances that President Xi might go to North Korea right before he comes to South Korea. So probably there's some possibility, in my view, that President Xi might not go to Pyongyang right now or next month because that kind of shows to that kind of look. The optic of that could not be too positive, especially in the eyes of Washington. So maybe the President Xi might delay that a little bit, visit Pyongyang in May, and follow that with a visit to South Korea in June.
So you think President Xi Jinping would be a little more cautious in visiting directly Pyongyang and Pyongyang only?
Exactly, concerned about the optics probably.
Another upcoming event that's been talked about recently is the Belt and Road Forum that's set to be held in Beijing next month. Russian President Putin is expected to attend, and word has it that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is also invited to the event. If the leaders of the three countries could sit down for talks, do you think that would have some sort of an impact on the stalled Pyongyang-Washington nuclear negotiations?
Well, again, it's all about perception. Right now, we're at the diplomatic stage. We're not talking about actual confrontation between two blocs here. We're not talking about China, Russia, North Korea. Exactly. One hand, and then we have United States, Japan, and South Korea on the other. We're not talking about that here. But we have to focus on the thematic of this forum, Belt and Road Initiative. So I think North Korea has an interest in the Belt and Road Initiative because it's a way for North Korea to attract investment. And China has been investing in the neighboring countries in a large scale. So I think that North Korea has a virtual interest to participate in this forum. And probably the main topic of discussion will be about how to attract, somehow China and Russia cooperate together to bring investment or invest themselves in North Korea.
But you've mentioned that we're not going back to the Cold War era. It's not going to be North Korea, China, Russia versus Korea, Japan, the U.S. But still, some are raising concerns that closer ties among North Korea, Russia, and China could have a negative impact on Pyongyang-Washington nuclear negotiations.
Clearly, I think North Korea would like to give out this perception that North Korea's argument about denuclearization, which is very particular, which is kind of different from the United States, is being supported by China and Russia. So, definitely North Korea would like to give out the impression. But then from the Washington's point of view, North Korea understands that Russia and China are doing the most important job here in the sense that they're observing the economic sanctions that are currently placed against North Korea. Unless China and Russia decide to relax the sanctions in violation of the United Nations measures, I don't think Washington is going to really, increase the tension or exacerbate the problem by pointing out that China and Russia are to be blamed for the impasse in the negotiation between North Korea and Washington.
Now to Japan. As you know, Japan has opted out of submitting a joint UN resolution condemning North Korea's human rights abuses. Now, I understand that this is the first time Japan's done that in 16 years. Why the sudden change? What are Tokyo's motives? Well,
so in many ways, Japan has been an underappreciated player in the regional dynamics surrounding North Korea. But then in truth, Japan is a very important player. Japan is a very important counterpart to North Korea, both in terms of diplomacy and economics, actually. And there's been some talks that Japan and North Korea had established quote-unquote secret channels of communication, trying to settle this very important issue for the Japanese, which is the issue of the abductees. And that's been in impasse for like the last 10 years. So in a way, I think the Japanese government of Prime Minister Abe have been trying to reinitiate this negotiation with North Korea. And not talking about human rights so much this year. For example, there's no participating in this joint investigative effort with the European Union. It's a sign of goodwill that North Korea can take it positively and continue evolving the dialogue with Japan.
So the reason behind it is mainly the issue of abductees, no other political interests.
That's the understanding.
Now, South Korea's top nuclear envoy, like we've seen in our package, Do-hoon in report, Do-hoon is now in Russia for talks, and he's also scheduled to meet with EU officials later on. How should South Korea take things from this point on, especially with the regional players?
Well, I think South Korea has been assigned this role of intermediary between Pyongyang and Washington. We know that from the fact that the first thing that President Trump did after the Air Force One took off from Hanoi was to call President Moon to ask him to mediate between them and between Washington and Pyongyang. So I think there's an important task ahead for President Moon. President Moon will have to explain what happened, rather than what North Korea's position is going forward to the European leaders and Russia and China, and also trying to explain to them that the negotiation ahead is going to involve a very important, I would say, discussion over how to approach the denuclearization in North Korea. We know that the United States and North Korea are far apart when it comes to the approach of denuclearization. North Korea wants step-by-step approach. United States wants what's so-called the big deal, which is essentially North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons first in exchange for the sanctions being lifted. So I think South Korea is trying to mediate between these two positions. And the task ahead for the South Korean government is to somehow explain the situation to the European leaders especially, and also Russia, and then gain their support in the mediating role by South Korea, and somehow shrink the gap in positions between North Korea and the United States.
What are China and Russia's thoughts about the conflict between Pyongyang and Washington on the small deal and the big deal? The U.S. is demanding for a complete denuclearization, like you said, through big deal, but North Korea is demanding partial sanctions relief first for scrapping nuclear facilities in Yongbyon, so small steps, small deals.
Yeah.
What do you think China and Russia are thinking behind this conflict,
I think many players were very surprised about the outcome in Hanoi summit, because the expectation was that, actually the belief was that the North Korea and the United States have already settled this question of how to approach denuclearization. Before Hanoi summit, there was some understanding that even the United States would agree to implement a step-by-step approach to denuclearization, where North Korea, as you said, make a small step towards denuclearization, and they'll be rewarded by a small step, sanctions lifting or a similar measure, a small step again by the United States. But then United States, after the Hanoi summit, actually at the Hanoi summit, declared that that won't be the case anymore, which took many players by surprise, including North Korea. I think Russia and China feel a similar way about the sudden change in approach by the United States. And I think China and Russia, despite the outstanding issues that they have with Washington, I think they would like to probably convince Washington that Washington has to go back to the previous approach of step-by-step denuclearization.
Now, South Korea's top nuclear envoy, Do-hoon, is soon to meet with Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Morgulov. What kind of outcome do you expect from the talks?
I think the Russian side is going to affirm that Russia has a full support behind the South Korea's effort to mediate between Washington and Pyongyang. That's very simple, I think.
All right, thank you so much for your time today, Doctor.
Thank you.
And that wraps up this edition of Arirang News. Thanks for watching. Be sure to tune into Arirang for more news updates throughout the day.